on the effects of household inputs on children's development focuses on amount of time because of the data available. So it is harder to find data sets that contain both amount of time and some kind of measure of quality of time. So most of this literature has focused on time only. Here what we're trying to do is estimate the amount, the effects of both amount and quality of maternal time, determine whether inputs have different productivities depending on the dimension of development that we look at. So here we care about cognitive ability as well as socio-emotional development. And we're also trying to estimate heterogeneous effects, so trying to see whether the effects of quantity and quality differ depending on mothers' and children's characteristics. So basically the problem that we have here, it's a production function in which we have some kind of measure of ability of the child in the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side we have all inputs that go into the production function. So most importantly, T, it's maternal time investments, which are presumably differentiated by quality of that time. C is the amount of non-maternal time investments, so most importantly, childcare. And G corresponds to goods and services that are invested in children to enhance development. Then X is a vector of other individual and household controls, and then we have the household individual fixed effects. So basically, the problem that we're facing here is that inputs in that production function are endogenous, of course. So for example, mothers that invest more time in children are systematically different from children that invest less time in their children, or they take these decisions based on the unobserved ability of the child. So for either reason, all those inputs are endogenous. So the literature so far that has attempted to disentangle the differential effects of quantity and quality has been mainly a study of correlations or OLS estimations. So really no attempt has been made to try to correct for the endogeneity of inputs in that equation. Here I bring up, I think, the 4 papers that are closest to us in the sense that they do have in the same equation amount of time and quality of time. Probably the closest is Fiorini and Keane. They use Australian data. They have longitudinal data. And the way in which they try to control for the selection issues is by running they follow Todd and Walpin basically, and they estimate added value specifications and child fixed effects to try to correct for endogeneity. Here what we're going to try to do is focus on time in that production function, but differentiating by quality of that time, and we try to adequately control for the other inputs. In some of the specifications that I'm going to show you, we're going to then try to correct for endogeneity of amount of time, quality of time, and childcare. And then I'm going to show you some of the results, and we're going to try to also use the estimates to understand better the trade-off between quantity and quality of maternal time in a variety of ways. So for this analysis, we're using Colombian data from the data set that was collected to evaluate the biggest early childhood intervention that we have in the country, which is called Hogares Comunitarios. So this is not a nationally representative data set. This only contains data from the poorest households in the country, which are eligible for this early childhood intervention. The sample contains 26,000 children and their families, and it contains a wealth of data on quantity of maternal time, detailed daily routines and frequency of daily routines between the mother and the child, which we use to construct our variable of quality of time. And we also construct a variable of parenting practices that I'll show you in a second. And together with that, we have a variety of household and individual controls, and we have a few measures of cognitive and psychosocial development. In particular, for this paper, we're using the early development instrument, both the cognitive and the non-cognitive versions of it. So the cognitive version of it, this is a parent-reported instrument. So parents are asked to answer 12 items that measure different scales of cognitive behavior of children, such as identification of letters, spelling, relating sounds to letters, and so on and so forth. Takes a value of 0 to 1, where higher is better. Here I'm going to skip it because Jerry showed us already too many of these. So this is the correlation with income. And this is the Early Development Index, the psychosocial version. So these are 22 items, also parent-reported, that measure social behaviors and emotional behaviors in things like cooperation of children with peers during play, whether the child knows how to follow instructions, whether the child is aggressive, his inhibitory power, and things of the sort. It's an index that goes from 1 to 3, and again, this is a negative index. So the lower it is, the better, because it means the child has less behavioral problems. Okay, so what are measures of the key variables of interest? So quantity is measured simply and plainly by the number of hours per week devoted to childcare. So this is a mother-reported question, and she's asked how many hours she devotes to childcare during weekdays without sleeping time. And quality, we're going to be measuring as the fraction of that time that is devoted to active stimulation routines. And I'm going to show you in the next slide what are active stimulation routines. And finally, we control for parental practices, basically because some of the psychology and sociology literature emphasizes that it's not only what you do with the child, but how you do it that matters for development. So we try to control in some way for that how you do it by measuring the type of parents you are using discipline routines. Okay, so we differentiate between punitive parents and incentive-based parental practices to try to capture a little bit the type of parents that these are. So active stimulation routines, we basically factor analyzed all daily routines and frequencies that the mothers report to be doing with the child during weekdays. And the factor analysis gives us two most important factors. The first one discriminates between by frequency, so the activities that are done more frequently over the week, and the second factor discriminates by nature of activity, and this is the discrimination that you obtain from the factor loadings in the second factor. So as you can see, it perfectly discriminates between personal care routines in the left, things like brushing teeth, bathing the child, cooking for the child, and in the right-hand side, we have what we call active stimulation routines. So most of these are activities that are very intensive in verbal interaction with the mother, and some others are less straightforward, like watching TV or running errands. So in robustness checks that we do in the paper, we actually slightly change the definition of quality, but most of the major qualitative results that we get remain unchanged, as long as from the right-hand side, you always keep the activities that are very intensive in verbal stimulation. So this is just the factor analysis that discriminates. So the way in which we're going to try to address the endogeneity issues is by using instrumental variables for the endogenous variables, in this case maternal time and maternal quality of time. What we're going to do is use some measures of local labor demand conditions as instruments. So basically we have measures of how tight or not is the labor market in the department of residence of this mother. These are the variables that we're using as instruments. So average women's wage, average men's wage, the fraction of employment in services sector because it's highly female, and female labor participation rates. So these demand conditions are obviously correlated with employment choices of women, and thus with maternal time investment. However, we claim, and we have to show you, that these local regional conditions should not be correlated with innate ability of children, nor determine the child's cognitive ability directly. So for these local demand conditions to be truly valid exclusion restrictions, we need a few things to be true. So we need that these are pure demand indicators and not subject to changes in supply, of course. That there is no systematic variation in unobserved characteristics of women across states. So for example, that women in some department or region hate working more than women in other region, and that there's changes in the local market are uncorrelated with services for children that could also have an impact on achievement. So presumably it's easier for me to argue for 1 and 2, but 3, meaning no correlation with other services for children by department, it's less clear. So now I can't remember if I included it in this short presentation, but in the paper we provide some evidence that supply of early childhood services does not differ significantly between regions or departments that have tight labor market conditions with respect to those who don't. And in addition, what we do to try to address this worry is to include some of these state-specific variables that measure supply of services for children. And some other things that we think at the department level also matter for cognitive and non-cognitive development, like supply of the 3 most important early childhood programs. We have supply of health services, we have poverty, infrastructure, and things of the sort at the department level. So the instrumental variable is also at the department level. So here are OLS results. So in the left, in the first column, we have the cognitive measure. In the second column, we have socio-emotional. So basically what we get here is that both quality and quantity matter, and both have positive effects. So they increase cognitive development and they reduce behavioral problems. The parenting measure is just saying that more, because I didn't explain it very well, but the way to read the positive and negative respectively is that more incentive-based parents improve cognitive and reduce behavioral problems. Childcare improves both. Childcare is simply a measure of whether the child goes to a childcare institution or not. It's a 0-1. And then you have income, mother's education. One important one, because I'm going to show you some robustness exercises later using that, is the KIDI. That's a knowledge inventory on children's development. So it's a battery of more than 50 questions that we ask mothers about what they know about children's development. So obviously it has a large effect and it goes in the expected direction. The more you know about development, the better for the child. Okay, so here are the instrumental variables results, comparing it to the OLS. So basically, what we get here, so first of all, very, very briefly, the Fs, these seem to be pretty good predictors of both quality and quantity of maternal time. And in both cases, the over-identification test is rejected. We obtain the following results. So quality of maternal time is always good. So it increases cognitive ability, it reduces behavioral problems, and quantity is even conditional, and quality is still good for cognitive, but it's not good for behavioral problems. So the last column is reading that conditional on the quality of time that she invests, more time is bad for socio-emotional behaviors. But one important thing here is that in both cases, and most importantly in cognitive, the magnitude of the effect on quality is significantly bigger than the effect of quantity. And so what we did here is we standardized everything, the dependent and the explanatory variables, so that we can compare the magnitudes of the coefficients. And basically what we're finding is that quality is significantly bigger than the effect of quantity. Probably I can skip this, but that's some interpretation of what an increase of 1 standard deviation in quality means. So for example, it means increasing the frequency of one of the active stimulation routines from never to every day, or it could also mean going from 0 to 8 out of a total 9 active stimulation activities once a month. So there's various ways of increasing quantity in 1 standard deviation. The one thing that I have to show you about whether these are appropriate instruments or not is to show you that running an IV regression on child's birth weight doesn't yield significant estimates of quantity of quality. So it matters for investments after childbirth, but for an outcome at childbirth, quantity and quality doesn't matter. So that's good. So here what we're doing is I'm using the instruments to try to correct for endogeneity of quality and quantity of time, but I still have childcare, which is another of the inputs in the regression, which is also endogenous for the same reasons that I worry about. So here what I do is restrict the sample to children only in childcare. So basically I'm conditioning on children that actually participate in childcare. And again, the results are very similar. Quality is always very important for both. Quantity loses significance for cognitive ability, but is bad for socio-emotional behavior. And here what we do is we instrument for childcare using the same instrumental variables that we have as we have for. And again, the qualitative results, probably the magnitudes change a little bit, but the qualitative results remain the same. Quality is more important than quantity. And both quantity and childcare harm socio-emotional development. Here what we do is split both cognitive and socio-emotional development in a couple of important dimensions. So cognitive we split into literacy and numeracy, and you can see that in the case of literacy, quality matters, especially for literacy. And this is not surprising because our quality measure basically it's capturing verbal interactions between the mother and the child. And so it has a negligible effect on numeracy. In the case of socio-emotional development, it seems that maternal quality of time matters for the social aspect. So the way in which the child behaves or acts towards peers, towards adults, towards the outer world, but does not have an impact on emotional. So emotional has to do a little bit more with self-control, inhibitory behaviors, things that relate to individual behavior rather than social behavior. And in that case, quality doesn't have any effect on the child. So finally here, I wanted to show some heterogeneous effects. So basically what we do here is interact quality and quantity of maternal time with how much the mother knows about children's development. And you can see here that it seems that the effects are very heavily mediated by how much the mother knows about development during early childhood. In the first part, where I present cognitive, the second column is the effect for mothers that are above mean knowledge about children's development. And you can see the effect is significantly higher than the effect for mothers that know very little about children's development, and that difference is statistically significant. Moreover, for mothers that know very much about development, quantity ceases to be important. So quantity only matters for the less knowledgeable mothers, but not for the more knowledgeable mothers. And in the case of socio-emotional development, something similar happens. So the positive effects of quality are stronger for more knowledgeable mothers. And in the case of knowledgeable mothers, the negative effect of time is not significant anymore. So really the only thing that matters is the quality of time, especially for knowledgeable mothers. Here what we're doing is interacting with that variable of parenting practices. Remember that measures how incentive-based with respect to punitive you are in terms of discipline towards the child. So here we're saying that the effects of quality, now I forget. A smaller number means that the parent is less punitive. So it means that it's more punitive. I'm sorry, negative is bad. So it means that the effect is really heavily mediated by also how you act as a parent with the child, meaning that if you're a more incentive-based kind of parent and less punitive, then the effect of quality are bigger than otherwise. And the same is true in the case of socio-emotional behavior. So the more incentive-based parent has a larger effect in reducing behavioral problems through quality. So finally here I'm showing similar exercise for age of the child. So we're basically splitting the sample into the younger children and children older than 3. And it seems that for cognitive behavior, quality is more important than for the older children, and that quantity really matters more for the older children than for the younger. Again, most of these things might be related with verbal development and verbal interactions, and those mattering more earlier when the children is learning to speak. And in terms of socio-emotional behavior, also quality of the mother seems to have a stronger effect for the younger children than the older children, and the negative effect of quantity is also smaller for older children. So quantity is harming more, in a way, the younger than the older, conditional on the effect of quality. And finally, by child's gender, we find that quality of maternal time seems to be more important for males' cognitive development, while quantity doesn't matter for the boys. And in terms of socio-emotional behavior, it has a stronger effect on females than on males. And the negative effect of quantity on socio-emotional for females is only marginally significant. So our interpretation of this result is that this is very related with role models, and how for social behavior it matters very much identification of roles between females, so the mother and the girl, than in the case of boys. Okay, so this is it. The conclusions, basically we're finding that quality improves both cognitive and socio-emotional development. In the case of cognitive development, the effect is always greater than that of the amount of time. Quantity improves cognitive development, but it is associated with poorer socio-emotional outcomes. And this negative effect seems to be completely driven by parents with very low knowledge about children's development. Quantity of maternal time helps children. I didn't present that, so I'm gonna. We have some other results for low birth weight and better birth weight. And quality effects on cognitive development are mainly driven by language improvements and not by our measure of numeracy. And quality effects on emotional development are mainly associated with social behaviors rather than with emotional individual behavior of the child. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raquel. That's very interesting, and I'm sure will cause a lot of reflection as we think about our own home situations. Our third speaker is Norbert Shady from the Inter-American Development Bank. Norbert.
I have no idea in Spanish how to do this. Does anybody know how to? Does anybody know how to put this on the slide? ¿Cómo hago para que esté como una presentación? Okay, see? Somebody always knows everything. Okay, so I was originally going to present a mixture of a number of papers, but much of what was in some of the other papers has already been discussed at length by various other presenters at this and other sessions. So I'm going to skip much of it, and I'm actually going to talk mainly about a joint paper with Karen McCours at the Paris School of Economics and Reynolds Vakis at the World Bank, and that's a paper that's now forthcoming in the American Economic Journal. And I was going to motivate it by showing what Jerry essentially showed. This is the same graph, just cut a different way, which is just basically saying that there are really steep socioeconomic gradients, income gradients, maternal education gradients, however you want to define socioeconomic status, in every country for which we have looked at the data, and these are the same five countries that Jerry was looking at. And I'm going to be presenting stuff on Nicaragua, and if you look at Nicaragua, these are graphs now for different indicators. The one on the top left-hand corner, which says TVIP, is the same measure that I showed you before, and on the horizontal axis is what we have is log per capita expenditures. This is for households in the control group, and what you see is that for a number of measures, but not for every measure, there are steep socioeconomic gradients. So they're steepest. This is actually quite consistent with what Jerry was showing. They're steepest for language. They're largely absent, for example, for behavioral problems, and they're largely absent for gross motor skills. But the point is, we see these socioeconomic gradients in a number of outcomes, in particular on language and on cognitive skills. And so you sort of sit there and think, well, if we have these steep socioeconomic gradients, maybe a program that actually tries to directly improve socioeconomic status, in this case a cash transfer program, can essentially, if you want to think about it that way, I mean the question is, this is not something, this is something obvious, but the question is to what extent could we move households along the horizontal axis by giving them cash, and to what extent would we then expect to see, or would we see actually improvements in cognitive and other child outcomes? And that's essentially what we're trying to, or that's the motivation if you want to think about it for this paper. So the program that we're looking at is a cash transfer program in Nicaragua. It's called the Atención a Crisis program. It was implemented for about a year in 6 municipalities in rural Nicaragua. And what's interesting about it is that it actually had a control group and 3 different treatment arms. And the three treatment arms are, one is the sort of what we call the basic package, which is a cash transfer equivalent to about 15% of the average consumption of the average recipient household. Then we've got a second package, which in addition to giving this 15% cash transfer, offered households, and almost all of them took it up, a training course, basically a course in which they were shepherded to municipal headquarters and were given then training in various income-generating activities. And the third one is the same package as the original one, plus an additional one-time lump sum payment, which almost doubled, essentially, the size of the transfer. All beneficiaries, regardless of the treatment arm, were exposed to repeated information and communication efforts. These efforts stressed the importance of varied diets, health, education, and they were meant to change household investment and consumption patterns. But this is not a conditional cash transfer. This is essentially an unconditional cash transfer in the sense that households didn't have to do anything in exchange for getting this cash. And it's a very, very poor area. More than 80%, more than 4 out of every 5 households in this area have a consumption per capita of less than $1 per day. So really very poor setting. The experiment worked very well. We have very high levels of compliance with the experimental setup, almost 100% take-up in each of the 3 different arms of the intervention that was offered. No contamination of the control group. I mean, one household, we don't really understand how this one household sneaked into one of the packages, but given that it's, I forget now exactly how many, 4,000 or 3,000, one isn't going to make much of a difference. The randomization clearly worked. We do all the various randomization checks, and nothing is significantly different between any of the packages, or nothing is significantly different in the household characteristics at baseline between households assigned to any of the packages. We have 3 rounds of data collection, and we have really, really low levels of attrition, remarkably low, really, 2.4% over a period of about 4 years. and it's uncorrelated, the attrition is uncorrelated with just about everything. Okay, so let's talk about the outcomes. We have anthropometrics. We have a variety of tests that I showed you before. Some start for children as early as 0 months, really, as you know, in the first month. Measures of social, personal, language, fine motor skills, gross motor skills. We have a mother-reported behavioral problem index. And then for older kids, we also have a variety of other cognitive tests, including the TVIP, which everybody must have by now discussed at length. We have a test of short-term memory, a test of what's called associative memory. And what's nice about it, too, is that almost all of the tests we have, and we'll run regressions also separately to see if this makes a difference, almost all of them are things where the kids are tested directly rather than things that mothers report. You worry a little bit sometimes that things that mothers report may be inaccurate, and maybe the degree of inaccuracy may be correlated with a treatment, and that's something that could be driving the results. As I'll show, that's not the case for us. I'm just going to show you, I mean, basically this is how the TVIP works. For those of you who are not working in this area, you show kids slides and ask them to identify particular words. The first slides are quite easy. Virtually all children can identify the boat. Then they get harder. This is, children are asked to identify what is it, where is it to measure, and you know, you can see that fewer kids get that correct, and then they get really quite hard for these kids. So for example, here kids are asked to say which one of these slides represents isolation. And if you look at some of the other tests, they're actually kind of funny, and you watch kids do them, and it's actually quite hysterical, sort of seeing them grapple with this. So this is the test of associative memory. Kids are introduced gradually to a series of Martians, and they're asked to point at the right Martian, but every time there are more and more Martians, and the game gets harder and harder, and by the time you're up to this, I couldn't make sense. I couldn't remember any of the Martians and their names, but some of the kids were really quite remarkable in actually being able to keep on identifying the right Martians. It's not just, so now you have all these Martians, you're asked to identify all the ones that you've been introduced to, you know, 15 minutes before, so it's actually quite hard. If you don't believe me, we can do it afterwards, and you will believe me then, I'm sure. Okay, and we also have very rich information on a number of intermediate inputs or risk factors, if you want to call it that way, consumption per capita, child stimulation, health inputs, and measures of the home environment. I'm not going to do this. I mean, basically, it's a randomized experiment, so it's not a big secret what we do. We compare households, and it's a randomized experiment with essentially 100% compliance, so we don't have to do IV or anything like that. We just basically have to compare households that received a treatment to those that received no treatment, or households that received a particular treatment to those that received another kind of treatment of the three different treatment arms. Okay, so this is the upshot. This is the first set of results. So you were all half asleep. Just open your eyes now, because this is where you actually see some results. So this is basically the impact of receiving the cash transfer after 2 years, or after a year, sorry, and after 3 years, on all of the individual outcomes, plus the average effect. The average effect is calculated by seemingly unrelated regressions, which is basically just an average of these other coefficients with the standard errors calculated correctly. And there are two things you want to think about in this case, or note in this case. First is, I can't hear anything. Yes. These are yeah, we have no attrition, so it's the same kids. Yes, it's the same kids. We have no attrition essentially of kids or households, and we have essentially virtually all kids take all of the tests. So it is the same kids. So, okay, the point is, a year after the program started, right as the program was ending in 2006, we see that kids who were randomized into any of the treatment arms, the average across the three treatment arms, have about a 0.1 standard, 0.09, 0.1 standard deviation better outcomes than those kids who were randomized into the control group. That's what you see in the first column, okay? What you see in the second column is, I think, what is more interesting, which is then there was an election in Nicaragua, and they terminated the program. And a big sort of concern in the ECD literature is this business of fade out, that you see these initial bumps, you see some program, whatever it may be, preschool, cash transfer, you name it, you see it having an effect, and then you see that effect sort of disappearing, and sometimes it mysteriously reappears 20 years later, like in the preschool program, maybe in some other dimensions. What's interesting here is 2 years after the program ended, those kids who had received the program 2 years before continue to have better outcomes of almost exactly the same magnitude as they did, if you want, while they were receiving the program. So there's no fade out. That's what you want to take away from this slide. There's a relatively small effect, a relatively modest effect of about 0.1 standard deviation, and no fade out of this effect. Forget these, just take my word that various robustness checks, it doesn't matter. We can cut these data lots of different ways, and you get the same effect. So this basically summarizes the first part, which is, okay, we get these effects. They're modest. They're about 0.09 standard deviations. Interestingly, they're all concentrated amongst the older kids 36 months or older. There's no effect for the youngest kids. It's all about kids who are between 3 and 5 years of age. And for these kids, the effects are not so modest, about 0.2 standard deviations, which is very similar to what you find for a variety of other interventions. For example, there's a very nice paper by Sami Berlinski, Sebastian Galliani, and Paul Gertler, which shows that in Argentina, 1 year of preschool, so causally, not just an association, 1 year of preschool leads to about 0.23 standard deviations better outcomes 3 years later. So we basically, for kids the same age, so we basically have effects that are similar in magnitude to what you find for preschool, say in Argentina. And if you want to compare it, for example, with just the sort of the cross-sectional association with maternal education, these are also pretty substantial effects, because 1 year of maternal education, sort of in the cross-section, is associated with about 0.05 standard deviations better outcomes. So it's equivalent for the older kids, equivalent, of course these are only, the maternal education ones are only associations, but it's equivalent to bumping up maternal education by about 4 years. So these are, for the older kids, these are not so trivial. So the second part of the paper, and that's what I'm going to focus on now, essentially says, okay, so what is it about this program? Is it the cache, or is it something else about the program? And what I'm going to be arguing is that it doesn't look like it's mainly the cache that is doing the heavy lifting in explaining these effects. And I'm going to show you two pieces of evidence that are at least suggestive of that. The first is that if you remember correctly, one group received a basic cache transfer and another one received a cache transfer that was almost twice as big. Right? The lump sum transfer received a cache transfer that was almost twice as big. So not surprisingly, what we see is the households that receive the much larger cash transfer do in fact have higher incomes and do in fact have higher per capita expenditures, but they do not have better child development outcomes. So receiving twice as much cash means you have higher income, even after, interestingly, even after the program ended and you no longer have the cash because they invested some of this, some of the transfer and actually had some productive activities as a result of that. But those households that received twice as much cash don't have better outcomes. The children in those households don't have better outcomes than those that receive the basic cash transfer. So it's the first piece of evidence that whatever is happening doesn't look like it's purely the cash. The second thing that I'm going to show you is that those households that were randomized into the treatment group seem to be doing various things differently in ways that, again, do not seem to be explained by the cash, by the income. And I'm going to show that to you in various ways. First, I'm going to be looking at intermediate inputs. I'm going to be looking at the pattern of expenditures, the degree to which the households engage in various stimulation activities. So for example, whether they read to the kids, they sing to the kids, whether there's a pen and paper available or pencils for the kids in the house, whether they've received a toy, things like that, and also various measures of preventive health use. And first, I'm going to just be showing you what happens if you compare all treated households with those control households, sort of controlling for, if you want, in some way for the differences in income. But I'm also going to be showing you, I think more convincingly, what I'm going to show you is by 2008, when the program has ended, if you look just at those households that received the basic package, right, those that received not the higher cash transfer, the basic cash transfer, in 2008, those households no longer have higher per capita expenditures than those in the control group. So they have the same per capita expenditures in 2008. Right? They received this cash transfer for a year. While they received the cash transfer, they had higher consumption and income. After they stopped receiving the cash transfer, they no longer have higher per capita. They spent it all. They didn't invest that part of the cash transfer. I'm going to be showing you that those households in the basic treatment group, even though they no longer have higher incomes and consumption, actually are doing things quite differently from those who were randomized into the control group. Okay? All right, so that's basically, these are first the results for 2006, and I have 4 variables looking at the pattern of expenditures on nutrition, on food, basically on food, 4 measures of stimulation, 5 measures of health and maternal mental health and the home environment. in the paper, we have a number of other ones. It's almost illegible if you include all of them, but just take my word, there are a number of other ones. And what you see here is, if you look at, for example, of food expenditures, of the total in food expenditures, households that were randomized into the treatment group are spending lower fractions on staples, that's what you see in the second row, and higher fractions on animal proteins and on fruits and vegetables. And that is the case if you don't control for income, or consumption, which is the first row. It's also the case once you control for the fact that these households, the treated households, have on average higher per capita expenditures. And basically you see the same if you look at all of the other inputs. What you see is they are more likely to have pen and paper in the house, they're more likely to read to their kids or sing to them, they read to them more hours, they're more likely to have toys in the house, they're more likely to have their kids weighed, they're more likely to give them vitamins or iron, they're more likely to have them dewormed. Not much going on in depression, not much going on in the parenting behaviors, which is what this home scale measures. And none of this really, by and large, none of it goes away once you control for the fact these households also have higher per capita expenditures. Now for 2008, I think it's even more credible in some sense. First column and second column is equivalent to what I showed you before. The third column, I think, is the one that's in some sense most interesting, because now in the third column, what we're doing is we're comparing households only in the basic treatment, right, the smaller cash transfer, with those in the control group. And as I showed you before, by 2008, or if I didn't show you, this is the case, by 2008, those households in the basic treatment group do not have higher incomes or expenditures than those in the control group, right? They have the same average income and expenditure. The only thing that's different is that one of them was randomized into the treatment group before, right? And even though they no longer have higher per capita expenditures incomes, they continue doing these things that I was telling you about before. They spend less on staples, more on animal proteins, more on fruits and vegetables. They're more likely to have pen and paper in the house. They're more likely to read and sing to their children. They're more likely to have a toy. They're more likely to give their kids vitamins or iron. They're more likely to get their kids dewormed. So something, I mean, the upshot of this, to our mind, is something other than the cash, or in addition to the cash. It's not only the cash that is explaining what is going on, because basically the argument is there are two pieces of evidence that we muster to show that. One is one group of households received twice as much cash essentially as the other one. There's no difference between those two groups of households. And also, after households stopped receiving the cash, they continue doing things differently, various things that we know from the broader literature are good for children. They continue doing these things more than those in the control group. So I think that points to, in some mysterious way that we don't understand very well, this program, which essentially gave mothers cash, but at the same time told them essentially, I mean, this is not like Progressa. They didn't have to come to regular meetings where social workers told them this and that. If you don't come to the meeting, you don't get your transfer. But there was some attempt when women were collecting the cash to tell them, listen, this is for kids. Remember, this is transfers for kids. You need to make sure that kids that you have diversified diets, that you read to kids. But that's about it. Pretty light in terms of what you would think might change behaviors. And nevertheless, these behaviors do appear to have changed in fairly dramatic ways between households in the treatment group and those in the control group. So that's, I think, quite remarkable. And the other thing that we think is quite remarkable about this is the fact that there really is no fade out, at least over this short time period. 2 years after the program ended, those households that received the cash transfers, or this package, this Atención a Crisis package, continue to do better in terms of their outcomes than those in the control group, even after the program has ended. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure Jerry will tell us what to do now, because he always tells everybody what we should do now. So I'll defer to him. Stay here, so I'll stay here.
Not here.
Not here, okay. Here.
So
we now do a
that's right.
dance routine, all three of us. I think that's what Jerry told me before.
That's right. So we have a short period of time for questions from the audience, if there are any. There's a person with a microphone there. Any questions? So, Raquel, oh, oops. I was just about ready to ask you a question.
This is a question for Norbert. Norbert, you indicated that all 3 treatment groups had received nutrition education and an encouragement to do growth monitoring or preventive healthcare activities. So the interesting test going forward would be to know how much of this nutrition education or collateral interventions that were part of your intervention would have functioned even without the cash.
Would have what?
Would have had the same impact on the child development outcomes without the test, and
Yep.
it would be interesting.
Yeah, I think I think that's a really good question. So it's right. I mean, I do want to say, I think nutrition education is sort of overstating it in some sense, because it makes it sound like there was this really active, I mean, really, women went to the cash collection points, and when they were picking up the cash, they said, by the way, Raquel, you know, you're supposed to spend this money on your kids and so on, right? So it's more like moral suasion. And what I'm saying is, you know, the kids are supposed to eat a varied diet. And so I guess you can call it nutrition education, but it's very light touch. But I think you're absolutely right. We don't know. If you just, I mean, my guess is if you just walk around and tell people, hey, you know, you're supposed to do right by your kids and give them, and don't give them the cash. My suspicion is nothing much would happen, but we can't test that here. So my suspicion is that, in some sense, sort of the cash, this is purely speculative. I mean, I'm just talking purely speculatively here. My suspicion is that the cash is a way of sort of getting the women into the program, and in some sense, getting them to listen to you, and, you know, giving them, I mean, in some sense, you can guilt people into doing something if you're giving them some cash as well. But if I just walk around and say, you know, hey, listen, do this for your kids, you know, my guess, but this is purely speculative, is that it's likely to have essentially no effect, right? Otherwise, we'd all be doing that. That'd be really easy. I mean, we wouldn't have to have any programs. We'd just walk around and tell people, hey, you know, why don't you do this? And they'd be like, oh, really? Okay, great, you know? I mean, I guess I'll do that. So I don't know. But my guess is that cash was an important part of it. But what I think we can rule out somewhat convincingly, this program did not operate just as, okay, there's an income. It's not like found money on your doorstep. It's not working like that. It's not like, oh, I have this money and I'm going to, because they don't look like they're doing the same thing with the money, and because those that get more money are not doing anything different from those who are getting less money. But it's a very important question, for sure.
Any other questions? So Raquel, how do you interpret the quantity part? Do you interpret that mothers really should spend less time with their children, or that the mothers who spend a lot of time with their children are doing something different with that time? Or how do you interpret that? And would you advise Norman when he's walking around to say, don't spend too much time with your kids?
Yeah, that is a good question, Jerry. So basically, how we are reading this is that conditional on the quality of that time, the more time you spend with the child, it is more likely that you are spoiling them. And what I like about the result is that the socio-emotional. So it's really, you know, condescending parents or parents that probably are spending so much time with the child that get nervous, get tired, get annoyed, and this has a negative impact on socio-emotional behavior. Yeah, but it's a good question.
For the hogares comunitarios, the program that Raquel, did you design the evaluation for that?
No, I didn't do the design, but I worked in the evaluation.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there were questions about father's time or not?
No. This, both time and routines were only reported by the mother. So in the equation, the only thing we can do about fathers is control for presence of the father in the household. But we don't know more than that.
Because I guess that it's, I understand why the question is for the mother, but I guess that the quantity and quality, it's going to be, the effect is going to be different if you have both times.
No, fathers are sadly neglected from most of this literature, actually.
Yes. I see that. Another question is going to be like, if I reviewed your results, or one reading of your results could be that, like, mothers with one child maybe are going to have better results in their childs than mothers with less, or not? Because it's, I guess that it's going to be more time and it's going to be better quality, or not?
Yeah, we do find that, but I didn't show it. So we have the how effects change by number of children younger than 5 in the household, and it's in fact in the direction that you're pointing at. So more children, then the effects are, I mean, the effects of quality are lower, and the negative effects of quantity are more harmful. So I mean, it's when you have more children, it is more difficult to invest in a good way in each of them. So there's a stronger negative effect or smaller positive effect when you have many.
Okay.
Hi, this is for Raquel. I'm going back to Jared's question. You said that conditional on quality, more quantity is bad. So this would mean that if I spend 100% of my time, or if the mother spends 100% of her time reading or stimulating, but then spends more time, that's going to be bad. And that's also true if the amount of time she spends reading is 0. So that sounds like a really, I mean, it still sounds odd. Is it possible to, I mean, do you think that maybe you could look at some sort of interaction between these two? Because it may not be true that it's just conditional, but it's basically a heterogeneity story, yeah, where there's complementarity, and then you may have some sort of nonlinearity where, you know, very high quality interacts positively with quantity, and then low quality interacts negatively, or something like that.
We have actually tried that to explore nonlinear effects and whether there's a complementarity or substitutability between quality and quantity. The problem is that we really have to look only in the OLS, because instrumenting all of those things, it just goes crazy, the regression. And in the OLS, there's all sorts of problems, but it seems to be a complementarity in the OLS, but I really don't present it because it's hard to be able to control for any endogeneity in the nonlinear regression. But it seems to be the case in the OLS. Yeah, you're right.
Hi, this is also for Raquel. I have been following some literature about birth order and also quality time or quantity time. I think there is a paper of Joseph Price. I don't know. I don't remember. I don't recall exactly in which journal, but they of course state that there is some intra-household allocation of time as well, and that birth order within the household is an important variable to consider. Have you tried to control for that, or try to check some to make some robust checks about this type of thing?
Now I forgot. So it is controlled for in the baseline specification, and we have run the heterogeneous effects as well. I forget whether it was consistent with what one should expect, but this literature, it's very robust in showing that the firstborn fares better than the children after, him or her. I think ours was consistent, but I can't recall exactly what we got.
Okay, very good. We're going to have to liberate the space and liberate the speakers. So thank you very much, Raquel. Thank you very much, Norbert. Thank you very much, Jerry. And we'll go on to the next event.